My name is Mark. I'm 32 years old, and I've always believed that being the eldest son meant carrying a responsibility heavier than anyone else could see, a kind of invisible duty that never allowed me to stand by when someone in the family was falling apart. And maybe that's why my life has always been shaped less by what I wanted and more by what I felt others needed from me. Because while other people my age were buying new phones, planning fancy vacations, or upgrading their cars, I was the one who always tightened the belt, who always stepped in to cover a gap, who always believed that family loyalty wasn't a choice, but a calling carved into your very bones. So when my younger brother Ryan's wife came to me with tears in her eyes, voice trembling as she confessed that they were behind on rent and the landlord was threatening to evict them within the week, I didn't hesitate. I didn't think about my own bills or the fact that I was still paying off debts of my own. I didn't weigh pros and cons. Because the truth is I've always carried Ryan in a different way than I carried the rest of the family. Always seen him as the boy I used to protect when kids bullied him at school, the teenager I used to cover for when he snuck out at night, the man I still felt an instinctive responsibility toward even though he was married now and should have been running his own household without leaning on me. But blood blinds you sometimes. It tells you that sacrifice is noble even when it's foolish, so I made a decision that still burns in my chest when I think about it. I sold my car, the one thing I had bought with my own hard-earned savings, the thing I had quietly cherished because it represented independence, progress, a little piece of dignity in a life that was otherwise practical and restrained, and I handed over the money to Ryan and his wife without asking too many questions, without demanding receipts or proof, because in my mind, a brother's plea was proof enough. But what I didn't know then was that this act of sacrifice would not only open my eyes to truths about Ryan I had been too blind to see, but would also force me into a confrontation with betrayal that felt personal in a way no stranger could ever hurt me. And before I tell you where it all led, I want to pause and ask you something. Because stories like this aren't just mine, they belong to all of us who have given too much, trusted too blindly, and found ourselves holding the shards of our own generosity. So tell me, where are you listening from right now? What city and what country? Because I love knowing just how far this community of ours reaches. And if you've ever carried the weight of family on your shoulders, if you've ever been the one people turn to until you started to break, then consider joining this space by subscribing. Because here we don't just tell stories, we share wounds and lessons. We remind each other that even the deepest cuts can heal when they're spoken aloud. And now, back to where it all began, because once I handed Ryan that money, believing I had saved him and his wife from humiliation and despair, I had no idea I was about to step into the darkest and most humiliating chapter of my own life. A chapter that would begin with sacrifice but spiral quickly into suspicion, betrayal, and a confrontation that would shake the very foundation of what I thought brotherhood meant. Because just 1 week later, as I dragged myself home from a long day at work, still calculating how I would manage without a car and how much longer I'd need to rely on public transportation, I saw something that made my heart stop. A gleaming brand new car parked at Ryan's place. One I knew neither he nor his wife could afford. And when I saw him laughing, arm around a woman who wasn't his wife, but a girl half her age, stepping out of that car like a man without a care in the world, I realized that the brother I had sacrificed for wasn't drowning at all. He was swimming in a double life, one I had unknowingly funded. And that was the moment the story shifted from sacrifice to a betrayal that demanded consequences. When I first saw Ryan step out of that brand new car with a girl who was definitely not his wife, laughter spilling out of him like he hadn't a care in the world, I remember freezing in my tracks, the kind of freeze that doesn't just lock your body, but seems to slow your heartbeat. Because in that moment my brain was wrestling with two realities. The one I had lived in for years where Ryan was my struggling younger brother, a man who made mistakes but always had my protection, and the new reality I was staring at, one where Ryan was living a double life, a man who wasn't drowning in overdue rent but swimming in luxury and secrecy. And it was like watching the foundations of my loyalty crack in real time. But instead of storming up to him and unleashing the fury that was already bubbling in my chest, I turned and walked away. Not because I was weak, but because something in me snapped into a colder clarity, the kind that whispers, don't act yet, watch, learn, and let him show you who he really is. So I went home, sat in the silence of my apartment, and replayed every memory, every call, every tearful plea from Ryan and his wife. And suddenly cracks I had ignored before lit up like neon signs. Little inconsistencies about their money problems. The way Ryan always seemed to have new shoes, or how he'd mention nights out with friends while his wife was at home, but I had written it off as bad budgeting, as the immaturity of a younger sibling who never learned responsibility. Yet now, with that car in my mind's eye, I realized I had been enabling something far uglier. And as the days went on, I began quietly watching, sometimes swinging by his neighborhood after work, sometimes pretending to drop off small things just to test the waters. And what I found was a pattern that broke me in ways I didn't expect. Because while his wife thought he was at work, Ryan was parading around town with this girl, a woman named Claire, who couldn't have been more than 23, living like some kind of bachelor even though he had a wife at home who was sacrificing and begging on his behalf. And I began to see not just betrayal toward me, but betrayal toward her, and worse, toward the very idea of family responsibility that I had spent my whole life upholding. And I'll be honest with you, that was the hardest part, realizing I had sold my car, my independence, to keep a roof over his head, only to discover that roof wasn't sheltering a family but hiding secrets. And I wrestled with it in silence, because confronting him without proof would only make me look bitter or jealous, and Ryan was slick, always able to twist words, to play the victim. So instead of an explosion, I chose patience, and I started digging deeper, asking quiet questions, listening more carefully to his wife when she called me, noticing that while she thought the rent was paid late, Ryan always seemed to have just enough to go drinking with the guys. And the more I connected the dots, the more I realized that this wasn't a one-time slip. This was a life he had been building, a charming, reckless, selfish life funded by people like me who believed his sob stories. And at night, I lay awake thinking about that car I sold, remembering how proud I was when I first bought it, how it had taken me years to save, how I had imagined maybe one day upgrading again, but instead of trading it in, I had traded it for betrayal. And I can't lie, it ate at me, it gnawed at my sense of self, because generosity has a way of turning into humiliation when it's abused, and I started to feel humiliated, like the biggest fool alive. But humiliation has a strange twin, and that twin is rage, not the kind you scream into a pillow, but the kind that starts to plan, the kind that starts to think about exposure, about balance, about justice. And while I won't tell you yet exactly how I chose to act, I will tell you this. The day Ryan's wife called me again, crying because she couldn't understand why the rent was still late even though I had given them enough money to cover 2 months, was the day I realized the story was no longer about me selling my car. It was about uncovering a man who had built his whole image on lies, and I decided then and there that I was done being the quiet, dependable older brother who carried the weight, because Ryan wasn't just wasting my sacrifice. He was spitting on it, and sooner rather than later, he was going to feel what it meant to take advantage of the wrong person. Because family can forgive mistakes, but family should never forgive betrayal, and Ryan was about to learn that the hard way. The breaking point came one night when Ryan's wife, Emily, showed up at my apartment unannounced, her face blotched with tears, her voice trembling as she told me that the landlord had delivered a final notice and that unless they came up with the full back rent by Friday, they were out. And as she clutched her purse like it was the only thing holding her together, I realized that she truly had no idea what Ryan had been doing, that she was as much a victim of his lies as I was. And in that moment, the final piece of my anger clicked into place, because betrayal is bad enough when it happens to you. But when you see it wrecking someone innocent, someone who trusted and loved without suspicion, it becomes unbearable. And I knew then that it was time to stop watching and start acting. So I told her not to worry, that I would take care of it, and I meant it, but not in the way she expected. Because the truth was I had been quietly gathering evidence, taking photos of Ryan and Claire together, saving copies of his social media posts where he flaunted drinks and nights out, even overhearing conversations when he thought I wasn't around. And now I had more than enough to prove that Ryan wasn't a struggling husband, but a double-dealing liar. So I crafted a plan, not just to confront him privately, because men like Ryan thrive in the shadows where words can be twisted, but to drag him into the light where his charm couldn't save him. And the opportunity came faster than I expected when Ryan called me himself 2 days later, pretending to be stressed, his voice filled with fake worry as he said he might need to borrow more money just to get over this last hump. And that was the moment I decided to set the trap. So I told him yes, let's meet, and I suggested dinner, saying I'd bring some cash to help. But what I didn't tell him was that I had also invited Emily under the pretense that I wanted to talk about how to support them, and I chose a busy restaurant in the center of town, the kind of place where people from work, neighbors, even mutual friends often showed up, because I wanted eyes on this. I wanted an audience when the mask finally fell, and the night of the dinner I sat there waiting, my stomach churning with a strange mix of nerves and cold determination, until Ryan strolled in, wearing a fresh shirt, grinning like he owned the world, and behind him, to my complete lack of surprise, Claire slipped in too, hanging back as if she thought no one would notice. But I noticed, and when Emily arrived a few minutes later, looking hopeful and tired all at once, the table was set, not just with plates but with truths about to be served hotter than any meal. And as Ryan started his routine, talking about how hard things had been, how he just needed one more chance, I interrupted him, sliding my phone across the table with the gallery open. Image after image of him with Claire, the car, the nights out, and I'll never forget the way his face drained of color, the way his mouth opened but no words came out. Because for the first time in years Ryan had no excuse, no story to twist, and before he could even try, Emily picked up the phone, her hand shaking as she scrolled, her eyes going wide with horror, and then she looked at him with a pain so raw it silenced even the background chatter of the restaurant, and she whispered, "How could you?" in a voice that carried farther than any shout, and people were staring now, heads turning, forks frozen halfway to mouths, and Ryan tried to stammer something about misunderstanding, about how I was trying to make him look bad, but before he could weave his web, I pulled out the final nail in his coffin. The credit report I had dug up showing the car lease under his name, the bar tabs linked to his card, and the receipts that proved he had been blowing money while his wife begged me for rent. And when I laid those on the table, even Claire took a step back, muttering that she didn't sign up for this, before grabbing her bag and leaving. And it was in that moment, with his wife in tears, his girlfriend gone, and half the restaurant watching, that Ryan finally showed his true face, not slick or charming, but small, desperate, pathetic, his voice cracking as he tried to beg Emily to understand. But it was too late, because she stood up, handed me my phone, and told him she was done, that she was taking the kids to her mother's, and then she walked out with more strength than I'd ever seen in her. And as the door swung shut behind her, the silence at the table felt like a verdict, one that needed no jury, and I leaned forward, looked Ryan in the eye, and said, "You made me sell my car to cover your lies. You made your wife believe you were drowning while you were out playing, and you made a fool out of everyone who ever loved you. But this is where it ends." And then I stood, dropped a few bills on the table for my own meal, and left him sitting there, with nothing but the wreckage of his schemes. But the story didn't end in that restaurant, because in the weeks that followed, Emily filed for divorce. His landlord took him to court for unpaid rent, and the job he claimed to have was exposed as a cover for unemployment. And the best part, the most ironic twist of it all, was that Ryan eventually had to sell that shiny car he had flaunted just to pay off some of his debts, walking on foot while I, the brother he betrayed, rebuilt my savings and bought myself another car, not as flashy but fully mine. And every time I slide behind that, I think about loyalty, about sacrifice, and about how betrayal always finds its way back to the one who commits it. Because in the end, Ryan lost his wife, his home, his reputation, and his freedom to pretend, while I gained something far greater, the peace of knowing I no longer carried his weight, and the lesson that even family, when rotten at the core, sometimes needs to be cut off for you to survive. And that's how it all unraveled, one lie after another collapsing until Ryan had nothing left to hide behind. Sometimes, betrayal doesn't just sting. It carves deep scars that never fully fade. And yet in the ashes, there's clarity. You see who you really are without the weight of someone else's deception on your back. But now I want to turn to you. Have you ever sacrificed something huge for family, only to discover they were taking advantage of you? I'd love to hear your story in the comments, because this community is built on sharing truths that many people carry alone. Tell me, too, where you're watching from. It amazes me to see how far these stories travel, how they connect us across cities, countries, and lives. And if you felt the sting of betrayal but found the strength to rise above it, then make sure you join our growing family by subscribing, because here, you'll always find stories that echo the pain, but also the power of moving forward stronger than before.